Kazakhstan is a place I consider home. The interesting aspect about Kazakhstan, although it is now recently changed, is that it was one of the longest places I've ever lived. The U.S. has become that very quickly in recent years. Specifically, Springfield has become home. Springfield, Oregon has become home. But for the longest time, and very much so, still big place in my heart for Kazakhstan, and I still consider it home in many ways. When we first got to Kazakhstan, one of the things that I noticed right away, which now I notice every time I go to a different country, is that every country has its own unique smell. And it's, I don't want to talk about it too much because I'm sure there's lots of reasons that I don't want to get into, but it's very interesting to me. And I remember with Kazakhstan, that was kind of the first time that I noticed that there was a very distinct smell. And I remember being old enough to just really be taking it all in. I remember driving to our apartment where my dad had already gotten things set up for us to be able to live there, and looking at the streets, looking at the people, taking in just like the different language, the street signs that were written in different languages. I remember that very distinctly. It was a moment for me where it was like, we're in a different country. So Kazakhstan very much for me is home and in my heart. I love Springfield, Oregon, but I will always take the opportunity to be able to go back to Kazakhstan if it's possible. One thing that made it different in Kazakhstan than any other countries that we lived in, and this story is a fairly long story, so I'll try not to make it too much, and it's not completely mine, so I have to be careful. Just in the sense that I want to honor and respect different things that happened. Basically, if you remember a while back, I talked about my dad going to Fuller Seminary in Pasadena, California. I got the names right. Woot! He studied under two guys named John Wimber and Peter Wagner. And they were Holy Spirit-filled charismatics. And being a good Presbyterian boy that my dad was, he experienced a lot of things that made it to where he believed in it. But at the same time, because of the missions agency that he chose and everything, they weren't necessarily things that he publicly taught about or emphasized on. Not for any bad reasons that I know of, but mostly out of, I think, respect for the agency that he was with and the denomination he was under. But he believed in them and practiced them himself. So what was interesting is when we got to Kazakhstan, what started happening was we had a lot of our young believers start having experiences with God that were very unique and very different. And thankfully, my dad was in a position where he understood what was happening and looked into it and made sure, but basically realized that God was doing things that that my dad hadn't necessarily shared about or preached on or anything like that. I'll give you one story. One of the guys who really changed what happened in Kazakhstan in regards to our church, a good friend of mine, he and his brother I love very dearly, older guys, and consider them older brothers. Basically, he woke up in the middle of the night speaking in another language that he didn't understand. And he thought that he was going crazy and having a problem, so he immediately went to my dad and told him what was going on. And my dad was like, oh, and I mean, it wasn't right away, but basically after looking into it, my dad realized that this guy's speaking in tongues. And that was a huge moment for this young man, to the point where his relationship with God became so strong that he went out and was just like one of our biggest evangelists. He literally brought over 100 people to the Lord, and really it's kind of what sparked the beginning of the growth of Joy Church in Almaty, Kazakhstan. I share that even though it was a little bit later as far as us being there, because long story short, my dad was no longer had a relationship with the missions agency he was with due to theological differences. I'll put it that way. It was a tough time. I remember it was really difficult. We went through a few different situations, But what ended up happening was the typical amount of time that you would spend in a country changed because my dad's job changed, just in the sense of who he worked for, not necessarily the job that he did. And so that meant, I'll come back to that probably some and share some aspects of that story, but that meant that we stayed in Kazakhstan a lot longer than we stayed anywhere else. And because of that, and my own personal experiences in Kazakhstan, both just growing up as well as my own spiritual experiences, made it to be where there was a lot that happened in Kazakhstan that affected me. In good ways, bad ways, sideways, up ways, whatever you want to say. But ultimately, I wanted to share the aspect that Kazakhstan really is home for me. And it's kind of one of those things like when you grow up and you have your own new home with your own family, and that is still home. But when you go back to visit your parents' house where you grew up in your old room, that's still your old home. And so Kazakhstan will always be my old home, I guess you could say. And yeah, I guess that's what we're stopped for today. I'm going to definitely be sharing a lot about Kazakhstan, and so be ready for that. Otherwise, we'll talk to you tomorrow.